What you're about to see has never happened inside a London hospital. A royal guard, trained to stand motionless at Buckingham Palace, walked through the ward in full ceremonial uniform. And when he stopped at the bedside of Jessica Radcliffe, the influencer who once defended the guards in the rain, the entire floor fell silent. Why would a soldier break 15 years of unshakable protocol to honour one dying woman's last request? And what happened when she raised her hand in a trembling salute is something no one in that ward will ever forget. Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The clip didn't start with ceremony or grandeur. It began with a drizzle outside Buckingham Palace, the kind of thin London rain that soaks you slowly and without mercy. The forecourt was packed with tourists, umbrellas jostling for space, camera phones raised high. A cluster of them had gathered near the railings, laughing and pointing, waiting for one of the immovable guards to crack. "Come on, mate, give us a smile!" Someone jeered, their voice carrying over the crowd. Another tourist chimed in, "Bet he's dying for a selfie. Look at him, thinks he's a robot." It was the same taunts the guards heard every day, disrespect disguised as humour. But on that particular afternoon, one woman in the crowd refused to let it slide. Jessica Radcliffe, 28 years old, with soaked hair sticking to her cheeks and a phone in her hand, stepped forward. She planted herself between the hecklers and the silent figure in scarlet red and bearskin black. Her voice wasn't raised in anger, it was firm, cutting through the noise with something sharper than mockery, conviction. "They're not props," she said, her eyes fixed on the group. "They're soldiers. Every one of them has trained, served, or stood in places you'll never understand. You think this is theatre? It's sacrifice. It's history. It's honour." The jeering quieted, not out of respect at first, but surprise. Nobody expected confrontation from a stranger in the rain, but Jessica didn't stop there. She live-streamed as she spoke, explaining centuries of discipline, the unbroken chain of tradition, the families behind the uniforms. For 20 minutes she stood there, her words mixing with the rain, insisting that those men deserved silence, not laughter. The guard at the centre of it all remained perfectly still, as he was trained to do. But behind the rigid stance, he heard every word. And so did the crowd. By the time the tourists shuffled away, embarrassed and muttering, Jessica's clip was already spreading online. "Influencer defends royal guard in the rain." The headlines wrote themselves. Within days, millions had seen it. Comments poured in from veterans, families and strangers who admitted they'd never thought about the guards as anything more than background. "She reminded us they're human," one comment read. "She made me respect the red uniform," said another. But for Jessica, it wasn't about the views. She posted again later that night, her hair still damp, voice hoarse but steady. "If one person thinks twice before mocking a soldier, then maybe it mattered." That was who she was. Yes, she had followers. Yes, she could have spent her platform on fashion hauls, travel reels, or staged perfection. But she chose moments like that, moments where tradition was fading in plain sight and held people accountable. For months afterward, she continued to share stories about guards, about soldiers who stood in silence and carried memories that few outsiders ever saw. She became a kind of unofficial ambassador for respect, reminding strangers that behind the stillness there was blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Then the news came that stopped her community cold. Jessica was in hospital, not for a broken bone or exhaustion from overwork, but something far worse. A rare illness, aggressive, unstoppable. Within weeks, she'd gone from posting lively updates to appearing frail in bed, her once bright eyes dulled by fatigue. Her followers flooded the comments. "Stay strong, Jess. We're with you. You defended them. Now we'll defend you." The guard she had stood for that rainy afternoon saw the headlines too. Quietly, without a word to anyone, he remembered her. He remembered the way she had turned mockery into silence, the way she had carried honour on her tongue, as if it were her own duty. By the time whispers began circulating about Jessica's final wish, it seemed impossible. All she wanted was to see one ceremonial drill, one last performance of the tradition she had spent her last healthy months defending. But ceremonial drills don't happen in hospital wards, at least they never had. And yet, in the barracks across London, someone who still remembered that rainy day was already wondering if there was a way. Sergeant Daniel Williams had stood guard at Buckingham Palace for 15 years. In that time, he'd faced everything. Tourists screaming in his face, drunken stag parties mocking his silence, even one foolish man trying to snatch at his bearskin. He had never flinched, never broken discipline. That was his reputation. Unshakable, impenetrable, the kind of guardsman who could carry tradition on his shoulders without letting the world chip away at him. But even a man of stone remembers. Williams had been the one in Jessica Radcliffe's viral video. He remembered that afternoon like it was pressed into his skin, the rain soaking through his tunic, the ache of standing still while his jaw locked in place. He'd braced himself for yet another cycle of taunts and laughter. Then she'd appeared. He hadn't dared to react, of course, but he'd heard every word she spoke as she faced down those tourists. They're not props, they're soldiers. It was the first time in years he felt as though someone in the crowd actually saw him, not as a mannequin, not as a photo opportunity, but as a man wearing the weight of service. Back in the barracks, some of the lads had chuckled about the clip. "That girl's fiercer than half our recruits," one said. But beneath the joking, something shifted. They noticed the change in how people treated them afterward. More tourists offering nods of respect, more visitors lowering their voices around the line. Williams knew it was because of her. Weeks later, when her name first reappeared in the news, this time tied not to a viral defence but to a hospital ward, he felt the blow like it was personal. Jessica Radcliffe, 28, battling a rare illness that had left doctors grim. The same woman who had once stood in the rain defending him was now lying in a bed, fighting a battle she couldn't win. He told no one how much it rattled him, but every night, when the barracks quieted, he found himself replaying the memory of her voice, calm, fierce, unashamed. Then the whisper reached them. It came through unofficial channels first, a message passed along by a cousin of a nurse, then confirmed by a small circle of her friends online. Jessica had one final wish. She wanted to see the ceremonial drill again, the same drill she had spent months teaching her audience to respect. She knew she was running out of time. Williams sat in the barracks mess when the rumour was first mentioned. A corporal read it aloud from his phone, half smiling in disbelief. She wants a guard to do the full drill in her hospital room. Imagine that! The room filled with nervous laughter. Can't be done, another said. Uniform regulations alone would block it. And in a hospital, forget it. But Williams stayed quiet. He stared down into his tea until the murmurs faded. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it, because in his chest he felt something stirring, something heavier than regulation. That night, as he polished his boots with the same slow care he had practiced since his first posting, he thought about her again. The way she had stood there in the rain, not for herself, not for glory, but because she couldn't bear to see respect mocked. She had given him something he could never ask for, humanity in the eyes of strangers. Now she was asking for something in return. William set the brush aside and stared at the gleam of leather in the lamplight. He had never broken protocol in his life, but for the first time he wondered if maybe the truest form of discipline wasn't silence. Maybe it was knowing when to break it. The following morning he walked into briefing with his jaw set and his mind made up. Jessica Radcliffe wanted one last drill, and Daniel Williams was going to find a way to give it to her. The briefing room smelled faintly of polish and damp wool, as it always did after morning drill. Rows of guards sat with spines straight, boots lined perfectly beneath their chairs, the hum of discipline filling the silence before their commander entered. When Captain Harrington finally stepped in, his presence was as sharp as his uniform. A man of strict tradition, he didn't tolerate gossip. Yet even he could sense the quiet murmur beneath the room that morning. Everyone had heard the same rumour, Jessica Radcliffe's final wish. Harrington cleared his throat. "I'll make this plain. There has been chatter. Requests that we provide ceremonial display outside of approved grounds." His tone was flat, clipped. "It is against regulation. Hospitals are not parade grounds. We are not theatre." A few men nodded. It was what they expected. But Sergeant Williams raised his hand, a rare thing. He was not a man to interrupt the current of order. "Permission to speak, sir." Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly, then gave a curt nod. "Go on." Williams stood, his voice calm, but carrying weight that made even the younger guards lean forward. "With respect, sir, Jessica Radcliffe isn't asking for theatre. She's the reason tourists stand back now, the reason families tell their children to respect the red uniform. She taught millions to see us as men, not props." The room was silent. Williams went on. "She stood for us in the rain when she had nothing to gain. She carried our honour in her voice when we could not. If we cannot stand for her now, who can we stand for?" The words hung in the air, heavier than regulation manuals or tradition. For a moment even Captain Harrington was still, his gaze fixed on Williams as though weighing the impossible. "Do you understand," Harrington said finally, "what you are suggesting? Full ceremonial dress in a civilian ward, a drill adapted to a hospital room. The public would—" He stopped, exhaling sharply. Williams didn't break eye contact. "The public would see the uniform where it belongs, sir. With honour." The captain's jaw flexed. He looked down at his notes, then closed the folder with a decisive snap. "Very well. One man, one drill. It will not be recorded. It will not be for publicity. It will be for her. And it will be carried out with the same precision you would give the Crown itself." Williams inclined his head. "Yes, sir." As the briefing broke, murmurs rose among the guards. A few looked at Williams with disbelief, others with quiet respect. None of them could quite imagine it. Scarlet tunic and bearskin hat in a hospital corridor, boots striking tile instead of gravel. But Williams wasn't interested in their approval. He returned to the barracks with a single thought. This had to be perfect. That evening, as the rest of the regiment dispersed, he laid out his uniform piece by piece. The crimson tunic gleamed with polish, every brass button catching the light. The white belt was scrubbed until no shadow remained. He ran his fingers over the bearskin hat, its familiar weight both comforting and immense. He had dressed in this uniform thousands of times, but never like this, never for a woman who had once defended him with nothing more than words and conviction. When he stepped into the corridor, his comrades fell silent. No one jeered, no one asked questions. They only watched as he adjusted his gloves with deliberate precision, as though the very act of preparing was ceremony in itself. One young guardsman finally whispered, "You're really doing it, then?" Williams looked straight ahead. "I gave her my silence once. Now I'll give her more than that." The barrack seemed to hold its breath as he marched toward the waiting car that would take him to the hospital. For the first time in centuries, the unbroken wall of protocol had shifted, not for politics, not for spectacle, but for a dying woman who had once reminded the world what honour really meant. And Sergeant Daniel Williams would carry that weight into a place where silence was not tradition, but necessity. St. Bartholomew's Hospital on a weekday afternoon was like any other London institution, a steady rhythm of wheels on linoleum, the soft hum of conversation in waiting rooms, the mechanical chime of call bells. Nurses darted between wards with clipboards in hand, doctors leaned over charts, and families spoke in hushed tones around bedsides. Life and loss mingled in the hallways, ordinary and unremarkable to those who work there daily. Until the doors opened. At first, it was only the sound, a slow, measured rhythm of boots striking tile, too heavy, too deliberate to belong to a doctor or visitor, heads lifted, conversations faltered. A porter pushing a meal trolley stopped in his tracks as the figure entered. Sergeant Daniel Williams stepped across the threshold in full ceremonial dress. The scarlet tunic blazed beneath the sterile fluorescent lights. The brass buttons gleamed like fire against white walls, and the bearskin hat rose above him, impossible to ignore. The polished soles of his boots echoed with each step, turning the busy hospital corridor into a parade ground. A nurse carrying a tray of syringes froze mid-stride. A pair of children in the waiting area gasped and tugged at their mother's sleeve, eyes wide. Even seasoned doctors, usually impervious to distraction, found themselves stepping out of their offices, drawn to the sound like moths to a flame. "Is that—" someone whispered. "A royal guard," another voice murmured, disbelieving. The atmosphere shifted as he moved forward. Conversations died. The usual chorus of machines and chatter dulled beneath the weight of his presence. Patients sat up in their beds to watch. Visitors lowered their voices to silence. It was as if time itself paused to make room for him. Williams did not look left or right. His eyes fixed ahead, his pace steady, each step measured to the same precision he'd used on palace gravel thousands of times. But here, on hospital tiles, the sound was different, sharper, closer, magnified by walls not meant for ceremony. It felt less like drill and more like a heartbeat echoing through the ward. He passed an elderly man in a wheelchair who slowly raised trembling fingers to his brow in salute. Williams did not break stride, but the man's carer, tears brimming in her eyes, whispered, "He hasn't saluted anyone in years." At the nurse's station, a young woman pressed her hand to her chest, whispering, "Why is he here?" Another answered softly, "For her." For Jessica Radcliffe. The name moved like a current through the ward. Heads turned, doors opened. Even patients too weak to stand leaned forward in their beds, needing to see. The legend of the influencer who had defended the guards in the rain had reached further than Williams had realized, and now her defenders had come to stand for her. The corridor was packed with quiet witnesses by the time he reached the ward entrance. A consultant stepped aside, bowing his head slightly as if granting permission without words. Two nurses opened the double doors for him, their hands trembling as though they were afraid to break the moment with clumsy movement. Inside, the beeping of monitors was the only sound. Jessica's family sat close to her bed, weary but alert, and all of them turned as the scarlet figure entered. Her father's breath caught audibly. Her younger brother, barely 20, stood up instinctively, uncertain whether to salute or bow. Williams halted 3 paces from her bed, rifle clasped tight against his chest, spine perfectly straight. He didn't need to announce himself. His presence did the speaking. The ward, filled with the ordinary chaos of sickness only moments before, now felt like a cathedral. Nurses stood in the doorway. Patients leaned out to watch. Doctors removed their caps. The silence was not forced, it was reverent. And as Williams took his position, every person there understood this was no performance. This was a soldier fulfilling a sacred duty, not to crown or country, but to one woman who had once refused to let respect die in the rain. Jessica Radcliffe had grown thin, her once bright features softened by illness. But when the door opened and the crimson figure stepped inside, a spark lit in her eyes that no medicine could have given her. The oxygen mask hissed softly at her side. A monitor beeped steadily above her, but for the first time in days she lifted her head from the pillow. "It's you," she whispered, her voice rough but steady. "The one from the video." Sergeant Williams did not answer. His reply came in the crisp precision of his movements. He snapped the rifle from his shoulder with a sharp, ringing motion that made the doctors by the wall flinch as if they'd heard thunder. The weight of ceremony entered the room. Jessica's brother stepped back, giving space. Her mother pressed trembling fingers to her lips, and Williams began. The ceremonial drill that had been performed for 4 centuries on palace forecourts was now unfolding in the cramped ward of St. Bartholomew's. Boots struck tile with perfect rhythm, the sound echoing off plaster walls where paintings of sunlit fields hung. His rifle spun in deliberate arcs, bayonet flashing briefly beneath the fluorescent light. Each movement was slow, purposeful, as though scaled down to fit the sacred quiet of a hospital. No one breathed loudly. Even the machines seemed to hush between beats, as if the rhythm of ceremony commanded more authority than electricity. Nurses leaned against the doorframe, eyes fixed. Patients in neighbouring beds propped themselves up on pillows, forgetting their pain for a moment to witness something larger than themselves. Williams marched 3 paces forward, halted with a stamp that reverberated like a bell, and pivoted with soldier's precision. His every motion carried weight, tradition distilled into discipline, discipline distilled into honour. The walls could have been palace stone, the air could have been the gravel courtyard, but instead it was a room scented faintly of antiseptic, where a young woman lay fighting for her last hours. Jessica watched every second. The tubes and lines tethering her to machines seemed to fade as her eyes followed the rifle's sweep, the boot's cadence, the stillness between each movement. For weeks, she had grown weaker by the day. Now, for the span of a drill, she looked alive again. Her father wept silently in the corner, hand clenched around the chair rail. A doctor, normally so composed, blinked furiously to clear his vision. A young boy, another patient with a shaved head, no more than 12, stood at the doorway, jaw hanging open in awe. The drill neared its final sequence. Williams lowered the rifle across his chest, the blade gleaming one last time, and then, with perfect timing, he executed the last turn, coming to stillness before her bed. His boots clicked together, his posture unyielding, his eyes fixed just beyond the middle distance. The room was silent. Not the ordinary silence of a ward at night, but a silence alive with meaning. The kind of silence that demanded reverence. Jessica swallowed, lips trembling as she tried to form words. Her voice cracked, but carried, "I knew I wasn't wrong." People needed to see. Williams didn't move, but she didn't need a reply. His presence was the answer. For those gathered in the room, the line between ritual and reality blurred. The ceremonial drill, once dismissed by so many as pageantry, had become something else entirely. It was no longer about tourists or tradition. It was about one woman, her final request, and the soldier who chose to honour it. When the last echo of boots died against the tiles, no one dared speak. The drill had ended, but the weight of it lingered, pressing into every heart present. And then Jessica, with hands so frail they trembled at the effort, began to raise her arm. The effort it took was visible in every movement. Jessica's arm shook as she lifted it from the bed, the IV line tugging slightly at her wrist. Her fingers wavered, uncertain, but her intent was clear. Inch by inch, she raised her hand toward her temple. The ward held its breath, a salute. Fragile, imperfect, trembling, but unmistakably a salute. The gesture silenced even the quiet sobs. A nurse's pen slipped from her pocket and clattered on the floor, but no one looked down. Every eye was fixed on the young woman, paying respect to the soldier who had come for her. Her voice cracked the silence, ragged and thin, but carrying all the strength she had left. "Thank you for showing me what honour really means." Sergeant Williams had stood in battle lines, had faced down jeering crowds, had buried comrades with the steadiness expected of a guardsman. Never once had he moved when he was not meant to. Never once had he broken the wall of discipline. Until now. With deliberate calm, he lifted both gloved hands to the rim of his bearskin hat. Slowly, reverently, he removed it. For a heartbeat, the room saw not just a guardsman, but a man, sweat dampening his short-cropped hair, jaw tight with something more human than protocol. He stepped forward and, with a care that seemed almost ceremonial in itself, placed the tall black bearskin on the edge of Jessica's bed. The fur contrasted against the white hospital sheets, a relic of tradition now made intimate, personal. His voice, low, steady, unshaken, broke through the stillness. "No, Miss Radcliffe," he said. The first words he had ever spoken in uniform outside official command. "Thank you." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. A tear slid down her cheek, but her hand stayed firm at her temple, holding the salute until her strength failed her. Her mother grasped her hand, helping her lower it gently back onto the sheet. The entire ward was transformed. Doctors who had walked these halls for decades stood with hands clasped before them, as though they were parishioners in a sacred service. Patients who moments before had been groaning in pain now sat upright, their eyes wet with unexplainable reverence. Even the boy in the doorway, pale from treatment, pressed his small fist to his brow, copying Jessica's salute. No one spoke. The silence was not awkward, it was holy. For centuries, the uniform had been tied to palaces, parades, and the watchful eyes of tourists. Yet here, in the soft, beeping glow of hospital monitors, it carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer just the symbol of monarchy or tradition. It had become something human, something that acknowledged the bond between a soldier and the people who recognized him as more than a statue. Jessica's breathing grew shallow, but her eyes stayed fixed on the hat beside her. She reached a frail hand toward it, her fingers brushing against the heavy fur. She closed her eyes as if satisfied. In that moment, even Sergeant Williams felt the shift. His training told him to return the hat, to reset his posture, to lock himself once more into the stance that defined his service. But some things went beyond regulation. So he remained there, hatless, at ease yet unyielding, while the ward stood in silence around him. The only sound was the quiet rhythm of machines and the fragile breaths of the woman who had once taught millions that a soldier's silence was not emptiness, but meaning. And in that hospital room, every person present understood something unspoken. This was not a breach of protocol. This was protocol at its highest form, honor. The silence stretched long after Sergeant Williams placed his bare skin on Jessica's bed. It wasn't the stillness of shock, nor the sterile quiet of hospital corridors. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, thick with reverence, as though the very walls knew something sacred was unfolding. Then it happened. From the doorway, a small sound broke the stillness. A boy, no more than 12, thin from treatment and wearing a hospital gown too big for him, clapped his hands together, once, twice, soft, almost uncertain. All eyes turned, and then, as though permission had been granted, the sound spread. Another patient joined in, his palms muffled by IV tape. A nurse at the station raised her hands slowly, clapping with tears, streaming down her cheeks. One by one, every person in the ward joined. The applause quiet at first, but growing steady, deliberate. It wasn't wild cheering. It wasn't the roar of a concert crowd. It was reverent. Each clap was measured, carrying weight rather than noise. It was the sound of people acknowledging that they had witnessed something they would never forget. Williams stood tall through it all, rifle at his side, head high though still bare. He did not acknowledge the applause because this moment wasn't for him. It was for her, for Jessica Radcliffe, who had once defended honour with words when he could not speak. When the clapping faded, he resumed his position at her door. The ceremonial drill was finished, but his duty wasn't. He planted his boots at the threshold, shoulders square, and assumed the stillness of a sentry. For the next hour, while doctors passed, nurses hurried with carts, and visitors came and went, he stood guard. Some saluted as they passed him. Others bowed their heads. Some simply placed hands over their hearts. No one dared disturb the vigil. It was as though the uniform itself had transformed the ward into something timeless. Inside the room, Jessica's family sat in hushed gratitude. She had grown weaker with every passing minute, but her eyes lingered on the hat at her bedside, her lips moving in faint whispers that no one could hear. Her mother brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed it softly. By nightfall, Jessica Radcliffe passed away peacefully. Her final hours had been marked, Williams didn't move, but she didn't need a reply. His presence was the answer, not by machines or sterile procedure, but by tradition, silence. and the honour of a soldier who had stepped outside the palace gates to keep a promise. Word of the event did not spread like a viral clip. There were no flashing headlines or trending hashtags. Instead, it travelled in whispers. Families telling friends, nurses telling colleagues, patients telling loved ones. The guard honoured her, they said, each person carrying the story like a secret too precious to cheapen. The next morning, Williams reported for duty as he always did. His tunic was pressed, his boots polished, his bearskin once again perched high above his brow. He took his place on the forecourt, silent, unmoving, while tourists raised their phones and children pointed with delight. But inside, something had shifted. He no longer thought of the uniform as only belonging to palaces or parades. He had seen it mean something else, something greater. The red and gold had stood not just for tradition, but for humanity, for one woman who had understood it better than most. As the hours passed, a little girl in the crowd tugged her father's hand and asked, "Daddy, why doesn't he move?" Her father hesitated, then answered softly, "Because sometimes standing still is the bravest thing you can do." Williams didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't break. But behind the stillness, he carried Jessica Radcliffe with him, the woman who had reminded the world that respect isn't about rules, but about recognizing the humanity inside them. And as long as he wore the red, she would never be forgotten. If you were standing in that hospital ward, would you have joined the applause, or would you have simply stood in silence? And do you believe traditions like this still hold power in today's world, even far from the palace gates? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and your voice is part of what keeps these stories alive. If Jessica's story moved you, give this video a like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. Share this video with someone who still thinks the Guards are just tourist attractions, because moments like this prove otherwise. And don't go anywhere. More stories are appearing on your screen right now. Click one, and we'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same place, with another story that will remind you why honour still matters.